Today's story actually begins a little earlier than the birth of Moses and his rescue from a basket in the Nile River. The first line in the lectionary is, "A new king came to power in Egypt who didn't know Joseph," which means we need to go back a little earlier than Moses, like 500 years earlier. So if you remember a story I told you a couple of weeks ago about twin brothers named Jacob and Esau, well, Joseph was Jacob's son, his favorite son, much younger than his other 11 brothers, which made him particularly annoying. But the other reason he was a little annoying is that Jacob made it known that Joseph was his favorite son and born of his favorite wife, Rachel. And you may have even heard of this special gift that he gave him. You know, Joseph's amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So to be fair, he really was a twerp. And eventually his brothers grew so tired of his prancing and preening, they threw him in a hole. And they kept him there until they sold him to some folks on their way to Egypt. Then they gave his shirt covered in goat's blood to their father, so he would think that his beloved Joseph had been eaten by a wild animal. So years later, and it's a great story, but it's too long, Joseph ascended to the role of a trusted official in the Pharaoh's government because he interpreted a dream that foresaw a great famine. And so he convinced Pharaoh to build a vast network of storage barns to prepare. Now back home, the famine hit so hard that many people emigrated to Egypt, including Joseph's brothers, to avoid starvation. Now again, long story short, Joseph saved his brothers. But more than that, he saved Egypt. Despite being a foreigner, he was a hero. Except after they forgot about him. He was a hero. Until they began to resent all those families who had moved to Egypt to avoid starvation. 500 years later, there were too many of them. And the new king who didn't know Joseph said, "We've got to do something or they'll turn against us." They forgot. It's not good when a nation loses its corporate memory, because when a nation loses its memory, suspicion and prejudice can take over. Frightened or paranoid leaders conveniently turn others into a threat to our way of life. But isn't it interesting how even now, our way of life only applies to those who are trying to protect their power and privilege? And so they rounded up all those outsiders and organized them into work gangs. And they tried to crush them with slave labor, making it worse and worse. But as the story goes, the harder they worked them, the more children they produced. No matter how badly they oppressed them, there seemed to be nothing could work to contain them. So Pharaoh told the two midwives who worked with the Hebrew people to kill all the boys as they delivered them. And the midwives agreed, but wouldn't do it. And when Pharaoh realized he wasn't carrying out his orders, they lied and said the Hebrew women are so vigorous that they have their babies before the midwives can arrive. And so Pharaoh extended the order to all of his people to participate in infanticide, which is to drown every infant Hebrew boy in the Nile River. Now, why would anyone do that? Well, to victimize someone, you have to turn them into a threat. As one liberation theologian said, that's only possible if those in power can skew or even obliterate the corporate memory of the people. Ordinary people just don't go around oppressing and exploiting unless someone has frightened them and pointed to them as a scapegoat. It's a playbook that's been used for thousands and thousands of years. But then as now, just one person can interrupt the narrative, one person at a time. As we heard the story read, the life of Moses was miraculously spared. Great heroes often do have miraculous birth stories, and in fact, stories of other great Egyptian leaders include having been placed in a basket as an infant in the Nile River. But this isn't just a story about Moses. This is the beginning of the liberation narrative, the story of freedom from slavery, the escape, the wilderness, the complaining. Oh, all the complaining about how life was better back in Egypt. We're going to follow this story of God and God's people for several weeks now going forward. As liberation theologians declare, the point of this story is to demonstrate how the seeds of freedom for the slaves were sown years before through simple disobedience by women. The midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who tricked and defied Pharaoh. By Moses' mother, Jochebed, and sister Miriam, who carefully plotted a way for him to be rescued. And then the daughter of the very Pharaoh who decreed his death. As the text points out, the princess, who doesn't have a name, knew she was saving a Hebrew boy. She made a fool out of her father, whether she intended to or not. He decreed that death because of fear. She co-opted life because of compassion. The courageous actions of Moses later in life cannot be divorced from these women whose compassion defeated fear. And it inspires in me, once again, an appreciation for how small acts of compassion really are acts of resistance in the face of fear, which multiply then into greater acts of liberation. Moses was a great leader, but he's not the reason they escaped. Liberation is not the result of one grand gesture or great leader, but thousands of actions and millions of people that destroy dubious fear with rebellious compassion. And I think that's an important reminder in this presidential season. We should not aspire to elect a Moses-like leader who will deliver us and lead us out of our national crisis. Now, that would be great, but ultimately, someone else can't heal us. We need to inspire one another, because our acts of rebellious compassion multiplied will become the greater acts of liberation that defeat fear and fearmongers. Along with the providence of God, it is we, not who we elect, who will save our nation. Amen.